The next layout that might not be so obvious, at least when you just read the name or when you are familiar with XML already, that is a so-called scaffold. A scaffold is a layout that is specific to Material 3 design actually, because as you maybe already know, Material 3 brings a lot of typical UI components that help us with navigation, that help us with maybe implementing certain menus, that help us with displaying a certain title for a screen, so what a user can do there. For example, with a top app bar, so just a toolbar on top of a screen. For example, with a bottom app bar, so a bottom navigation bar is how it was called in XML. So just a little bottom bar with maybe 3 icon buttons that we can click on to navigate between different screens. But Material 3 also brings things like a navigation drawer, so something we can drag from the left to the right to actually kind of open another separate sheet that we can open by swiping. And it also brings things like a floating action button, so just a round action button that is typically used to maybe initiate creating an item, to maybe save something, so just to highlight the primary action on a certain screen. And based on the Material 3 guidelines, so the design guidelines, all these different components like the bottom bar, the floating action button, top bar, and all that stuff, they have to stick to certain design conventions. So that means specifically, they need to be at certain positions on the screen in certain sizes. Because very often when you use multiple of these types of components together, there is a layout that helps us to position these at exactly the right spot. And that's the scaffold. So let's simply type scaffold here. You will actually make use of this quite often. So use this normal scaffold, really just gives us a block of code. You can also see we immediately get that preview, and here in the list of parameters you will see that we have a lot of composable lambdas that we could pass in here. Specifically one for each type of Material 3 layout component or a screen component we could make use of. So for top app bar, for a bottom bar, for navigation for example, for showing snack bars and also just Material 3 or material design components, for floating action buttons and so on. So for example, if we would want to add a top app bar to our design, we would want to make use of this top bar composable. And here we can then make use of ready-made Material 3 top app bar composables like this one. There are different types of this. I will link videos down below where I dove into the details of all these different types of top app bars. So we have a medium-sized one, large one, center one, a normal one. I also talk about how we can use this to maybe collapse the top app bar on scroll. But this video is really dedicated on scaffold and what's the purpose of it. So I won't dive into the details of each component here separately. But if we add this top app bar, we can declare a title in form of a composable lambda. So we just enter some sort of text. Hello world, for example. We might want to give it a navigation icon, which is the typical back arrow. So if we can navigate back, then we might want to add this to our top app bar. So this could be an icon button. So far, we're not going to do anything when we click it. It's really just for visual purposes here in this video. And we then have an icon, pass in an image vector, so some kind of icon, where we say icons, auto mirrored it actually is, .default, .arrow back. The content description for this icon could then be go back. And if we then also go to this top app bar, Alt enter here and opt into this experimental Material 3 API, then something now preview is happening and boom, we see our top app bar being put at exactly the right position. And so far, this is really no different than if we would have put this top app bar in a pure column. Because in a pure column, this would also just be placed at the very top if it's the first composable in that column. However, the scaffold really offers us all these different slots. That is, I think, the best way to think about it. So slots for ready-made components. So there's kind of an invisible slot for top app bar here. There's an invisible slot at the bottom here for a bottom app bar. There is an invisible slot for a floating action button. That all just stick to the right conventions with the right spacings, with the right size, with the right font size, so that you have a user-friendly screen. So for example, if we go on here after the top app bar and we specify a bottom bar, which also is just a lambda, where we pass in something like a bottom app bar. This could, of course, also be a completely custom bottom app bar, so you don't have to use the Material 3 one here, but this is just a pre-made composable here, so we can make use of that. But if you have a completely custom styled bottom app bar with your own design, then you can, of course, also use these scaffold slots here. In this bottom app bar, we can just add 2 icons for now. So icons, screen destinations we can click on to navigate, which we can do with a navigation bar item. We need to say whether that item is currently selected. So if we are on that screen or not, which I will just hardcode here, but in a real use case, this selected boolean here would need to be dynamic and update depending on the screen destination you're currently on. We again have an empty on click lambda. We could pass something like an icon which is simply an icon here with an image vector again. Something like icons default. I don't know. Let's use the star icon. Let's pass null as the content description. And then you can already see on the right side here that we have a bottom app bar with a single destination, so with a single option. We could, for example, also give this a label with this label composable, where we say, just go to text. And the text says, I don't know, favorites or so. So to go to the favorite screen. And then you can see the label will also appear here below our icon. Of course, it doesn't make sense to only have a single option, so we can maybe copy paste this to have a second one. This one obviously can't be selected if the first one is selected already, but we can then swap this icon out with maybe search, and we also say the label is search. And then we have the typical bottom navigation bar we might already know from other Android apps, which you can use, I think, with up to 4 or 5 such actions. But the important part here is really that the scaffold will just put this bottom app bar at the right place with the right dimensions, and it takes care of all the rest of the padding and what is relevant for that. And of course, you could also take such a bottom app bar or a top app bar, extract that into a separate composable function, so the scaffold does not contain that much of code here, which can make it a bit harder to follow what happens where. But that is, of course, always an option if you're using Compose. Let's take a look what else options we have here. Let's take a look here. So I talked about floating action buttons, which you can also create here. So if we have a floating action button, we can create this with a floating action button composable. We can say on click. At this point, nothing will happen there as well. You can see we can further configure this. We can decide about its shape, the container color, so the color of the floating action button, the content color. Content color in Compose is always referring to the color drawn on top of a certain background, so either the color of an icon or of a text. We can decide about its elevation, so the amount of shadow that is drawn, and we can just pass an icon that we want to show with it. So, for example, icons default add, and then we say content description is null. And then on the right side, you can see we now have a floating action button at exactly the right position with the right spacings here to the right edge of the screen and to the bottom bar. And if you would now decide, okay, we actually don't want to have this bottom bar and we remove it again, like this, let's cut this out for now, then you will notice, okay, if there is no bottom bar, then the floating action button will also know its fixed slot. So then it won't stay at the same static position as before, as when we had a bottom bar, but it will actually then just jump below. Okay, let's take a look at which other lambdas we get here. So we've already dealt with a bottom bar, floating action button, top bar. So we have a snack bar host. That's also interesting, which allows us to easily show snack bars in our composable. Let's do that. We have a snack bar host, and in there we need to use the snack bar host composable, which kind of links our scaffold with this snack bar host state. And well, since showing a snack bar is again something that we typically want to do as a result of a user interaction, this relies on Compose states. But I would say we are at a point here where we can already link this maybe with some basic states so you see how this works. Again, won't dive into the details into states at this point. There is a separate section that comes later. But for now, we could really just have our snack bar state maybe, which we create with remember. So this will really just achieve that the value of this is cached across recomposition. So when this scaffold is actually redrawn on the screen, if the position is recalculated, then the snack bar state won't actually change since we use remember. But more about that later when we also talk about things like side effects. If you've watched the crash course of Compose, then you have already heard of remember before. So we want to have a snack bar host state here, which is really just a plain Kotlin class instance, which you can then take and link to our snack bar host. So here we have our host state, we link our snack bar state here. And with this snack bar state, we can then just show snack bars. For example, when we click on our floating action button, that would be a use case. So here when we click this in this onClick lambda, we could use our snack bar state dot show snack bar, and we could pass in some message, clicked floating action button, for example. You can notice that this is actually a suspending function. So we need to call this inside of a coroutine here. You can get a coroutine scope inside of a composable by saying val scope is equal to remember coroutine scope, and we then make use of this scope, which is bound to the current composable here. We make use of this here on click, so we can say scope dot launch, and we move this in here. And I think we should be able to try this out by actually launching the live or the interactive mode here of the preview. So if we do this and we then click on our floating action button, there's our snack bar at exactly the right position. And this is again something that gets its fixed slot in the scaffold layout. Because as you can see, the snack bar is actually shown above the floating action button, which seems to be the convention here in this scenario. But if there wouldn't be a floating action button, or if there wouldn't be such a bottom app bar, then the snack bar would of course need to be shown somewhere lower. But all that is something the scaffold takes care of here. Something interesting you might have already noticed is that here for the actual content of the scaffold, so this is now the place where we can have our own custom composables, like a box, just to show you what this would refer to, a box with a modifier that fills the maximum size, where we give it a background of red again. If we do this, you will notice, okay, the actual content of our scaffold is exactly what we want to draw on our screen. So this goes in this trailing composable lambda here of the scaffold. But we do get a big red error here, which apparently does not prevent us from running the preview and drawing this box. But if we take a look here, it says content padding parameter is not used. What is the content padding parameter? Well, the thing is, depending on which scaffold components we now make use of, so whether we have a top app bar, whether we have a bottom bar here, that of course changes the bounds of the actual content we want to draw here in the scaffold. So you'll notice this if we actually go to our box and we add something like an hello world text here. You will notice that the hello world text doesn't really appear here. If we maybe increase the text size by a bit, so we say text is hello text, not hello, I wanted to type hello world, of course. If we have an hello world text here with a font size of something like 50 SB, something really large, what you will then notice is probably nothing yet. If we increase this to 100 dp SP, then okay, the text is actually drawn, but it's hidden behind our top app bar. Because by default, this content that is drawn here will just take the normal screen dimensions, and all the scaffold components will simply be drawn on top of it. That's of course not what we really expect, and that is why a scaffold gives us access to this padding value here, which is exactly the padding that we need to apply to our root composable here, that is the content of the scaffold, so that it exactly fills this red area, at least the red area that is visible here. So if we now take the padding and we apply this here after filling the max size for our box, so we say padding, and we pass this padding, then you will notice, okay, now our text is actually drawn at the right position where we would expect it. And then also if we make it, if we just remove the font size, make it a normal size text, then it's exactly drawn where it should be drawn, because the by linking the scaffold's padding here to our root box, this would just push the text from the top to exactly here, because the scaffold knows exactly which components are used here and which slots are occupied to apply exactly the right padding to our screen. And you should, by the way, still apply this padding even if you don't use any of the slots of a scaffold, because even if we take a look in main activity, you will notice that scaffold is actually the default composable that we have in a plain Jetpack Compose project. And here in this scaffold, there are of course no lambdas used yet for a top app bar, a bottom app bar or so, but you should still make use of this inner padding here for any type of composable you use in there. Because if you don't do that, I will show you this here on my launch device. If we actually remove this padding here and we don't reference this in our root composable and we launch this, there we go. And then you can see that our hello Android text that comes from this greeting composable is actually drawn behind our system bars. But if we add this inner padding again and then launch this again, you will notice that now it's drawn at exactly the position where we want to have it. Because by default in Jetpack Compose, if we enable edge to edge, what this will do is that the actual area on the screen where we are able to draw something with composables is just the whole screen itself. It does not start at the bottom of our status bar, but behind the status bar, because that would also allow us to have the status bar overlap certain composables, which can sometimes look really cool. But for things like texts or icons, we of course wouldn't want it to overlap these. So those are also values that the scaffold properly applies with this inner padding parameter. So even if you're not using these slots of a scaffold, I would always make use of a scaffold just to make sure that you properly apply this padding here to your layout. But other than that, let's take a look at if there are other parameters we can make use of here. Command P. So we can of course change the container color, content color, as I said. So this will be either the background color of the scaffold components as well as the text and icon colors. Window insets is something I will get to later in the modifiers section. And yes, if we would want that, we could change the floating action button position to something like center. We can set this to fab position center, and then you will notice, okay, the floating action button is actually in the center, if that's what you want. I think with a bottom app bar, this looks quite weird, but if you wouldn't have a bottom app bar, this is a quite viable position. But yeah, that is what you can do with a scaffold in Compose.